The people who scream the loudest about authority are usually the first to panic when real authority quietly walks into the room. The smell of charcoal, smoked brisket, and fresh-cut oak drifted across my driveway before the sun had even settled behind the maple trees lining our street. Every first Saturday of the month looked almost exactly the same at my house. My garage door rolled open at 8 in the morning. Classic rock floated softly from an old speaker mounted above my father's workbench, and one by one, polished American muscle cars eased into the driveway until chrome reflected every streak of golden afternoon sunlight. A cherry-red 1969 Camaro sat in the center bay like it belonged in a museum instead of my garage, its fresh wax shining so brightly that even the neighborhood kids stopped to admire it before running back to their football game. Friends carried folding chairs, coolers, homemade potato salad, and trays of peach cobbler, while the smell of sizzling burgers mixed with motor oil, fresh paint, and brewed coffee, creating the kind of Saturday that reminded me why I never wanted to leave the house my father built with his own hands. Nobody paid to be there. Nobody sold anything. We simply enjoyed old cars, good food, and better company. Retired firefighters argued about Chevrolet engines with Marine veterans. Teachers laughed with mechanics. My next-door neighbor insisted his homemade barbecue sauce could win state competitions even though everyone secretly preferred Frank's brisket. It was loud enough to sound alive, but quiet enough that you could still hear birds settling into the trees at the end of the block. Then I noticed her. Linda Whitmore was already standing across the street before anyone else realized she had arrived. She wore her usual spotless white blazer despite the warm weather, her blonde hair perfectly arranged, a thick folder tucked beneath one arm, and her phone already raised as though she had been waiting for this exact moment all week. She was not looking at the food or the cars. She was watching people smile, and somehow that seemed to bother her more than anything else. She crossed the street with slow, deliberate steps, expensive heels clicking sharply against the pavement until every conversation around the grill gradually faded. Nobody invited her. Nobody needed to. Linda had perfected the art of showing up wherever she believed someone else was enjoying themselves too much. She stopped just short of my driveway and looked around with the confidence of someone convinced she was about to make an example out of me. "This illegal gathering ends today," she announced loudly enough for every neighbor on the block to hear. Several people exchanged confused looks. Frank quietly lowered the music without being asked. One of the children instinctively picked up the football and walked closer to his parents. I set my spatula on the side shelf of the grill, wiped my hands on an old blue shop towel, and looked directly at Linda without saying a single word. Arguing with her had never solved anything. Silence usually made her reveal far more than I ever could. Her lips curled into a satisfied smile as she unlocked her phone and pressed 3 familiar numbers. I heard every word she said because she wanted all of us to hear them. "Yes, I need officers immediately. There is an unauthorized commercial gathering operating inside this garage. Multiple vehicles, excessive noise, and public safety concerns. Please send someone right away." She ended the call, folded her arms, and looked at me with the confidence of someone expecting handcuffs instead of questions. Around me, nobody panicked. Nobody rushed to leave. My guests simply continued talking quietly while smoke drifted lazily above the grill. Inside the garage, an older man wearing faded blue jeans, a navy polo shirt, and a weathered baseball cap calmly picked up another cheeseburger, thanked Susan for the fresh lemonade, and returned to his seat beside my father's workbench without attracting the slightest bit of attention. What Linda never noticed was that some of the most important people rarely feel the need to announce who they are. My name is Ethan Walker, and everything sitting inside that garage meant more to me than most people could understand. I was 42 years old, a classic car restoration specialist by trade, and the brick house behind me had been my home since the day my father handed me my first wrench when I was barely tall enough to reach his workbench. Every scrape across the old oak tabletop, every faded label on the metal tool cabinets, and every stain on the concrete floor carried memories that could never be replaced. My father believed a garage was not just a place to fix machines. It was where neighbors became friends, where young people learned patience, and where every honest conversation started with a handshake instead of an argument. After he passed away, I promised myself that nothing about those Saturdays would disappear. That promise slowly became a tradition. Once every month, friends from every corner of the neighborhood gathered at my place for nothing more complicated than burgers, old cars, and conversations that usually lasted until the stars appeared. Nobody ever received an invitation because nobody needed one. If my garage door was open, everyone knew they were welcome. Firefighters arrived after overnight shifts, still carrying the smell of smoke on their jackets. Veterans brought stories that somehow became funnier every year. School teachers forgot about grading papers for a few hours while mechanics debated whether carburetors still deserved more respect than fuel injection. Sometimes a retired electrician would help a college student change brake pads. Other times a teenage neighbor learned how to polish chrome from someone old enough to be his grandfather. The only currency anyone exchanged was advice, laughter, and an occasional slice of homemade pie. That simple tradition became one of the few things in the neighborhood that genuinely brought people together without asking for anything in return. Unfortunately, not everyone appreciated seeing people gather without permission from a committee. Linda Whitmore certainly did not. Ever since she became president of the Homeowners Association nearly 3 years earlier, she seemed determined to transform every ordinary moment into a written violation. I had received official notices because my garage door stayed open too long on weekends, because someone claimed my restored pickup truck looked too old for the community, because visitors parked legally along the curb during neighborhood cookouts, and even because my American flag remained displayed one extra day after Independence Day before I took it down the following morning. Each envelope looked serious. Every letter sounded official. Yet whenever I carefully compared the accusations with the actual city ordinances and the Homeowners Association bylaws, the facts told a completely different story. I had learned something valuable after the first few complaints. Never argue with assumptions when evidence speaks more clearly. That lesson was the reason a thick black binder rested quietly on the shelf beside my father's workbench. Inside were copies of every letter, every photograph, every certified response, every email, every property record, and every city document connected to my home. I updated it after every encounter, not because I expected trouble, but because preparation had always been easier than regret. Looking across the garage that afternoon, I noticed the older gentleman in the navy polo shirt smiling while talking with 2 retired firefighters about an old pickup truck from the 1970s. He looked completely ordinary, just another neighbor enjoying a cheeseburger and a peaceful Saturday afternoon. Linda never looked in his direction even once. She was far too busy watching me, convinced that this would finally become the day she proved she had been right all along. The distant wail of sirens drifted through the neighborhood only a few minutes after Linda slipped her phone back into her blazer pocket. The sound grew louder with every passing second until 2 patrol cruisers rolled slowly onto our street, their emergency lights flashing blue across polished chrome and freshly waxed paint without using their sirens anymore. The reflections danced across the hood of my father's old Camaro like ripples across still water. Conversations around the grill faded naturally. Someone turned the music down another notch. The smell of charcoal and grilled onions still filled the warm evening air, while smoke drifted lazily above the backyard fences. Nobody ran. Nobody hurried to hide anything, because there was nothing to hide. Linda, however, wasted no time. Before either officer had completely stepped out of their patrol cars, she was already walking toward them with long, confident strides, waving her thick folder as though she had finally reached the ending she had imagined for months. I could hear pieces of her explanation carrying across the driveway. She described an illegal commercial business operating from a residential garage, excessive traffic, dangerous congestion, noise complaints, and repeated violations of community standards. Every sentence sounded polished, almost rehearsed, as though she had practiced it long before dialing the emergency number. Officer Ryan Mitchell listened patiently without interrupting while his younger partner, Officer Daniel Perez, quietly observed everything around him instead of focusing only on Linda's accusations. His eyes moved across the driveway, the folding chairs, the barbecue grill, the children standing beside their parents, the classic cars parked neatly along the curb, and finally the open garage itself. Nothing about the scene suggested confusion or disorder. It looked exactly like what it was, neighbors enjoying a peaceful Saturday together. Linda pointed directly toward me with unmistakable confidence. "That man has been running this operation for years," she insisted. I have documented every violation. She held her folder a little higher, as though simply carrying paperwork automatically made every claim inside it true. I remained beside the grill with my blue shop towel draped over one shoulder, resisting the temptation to respond. My father had always reminded me that people reveal themselves most clearly when nobody interrupts them. Officer Mitchell finally approached with an easy, professional expression that never hinted at judgment. "Good afternoon, sir," he said. "Would you mind telling us what is going on here today?" His tone was calm, respectful, and completely different from what Linda had obviously expected. I smiled politely. Just neighbors sharing lunch, talking about old cars, and enjoying the weekend. You are welcome to look anywhere you like. I stepped aside without hesitation and gestured toward the open garage. Every toolbox stood organized. Every floor jack rested neatly against the wall. The polished concrete floor reflected the overhead lights, while family photographs hung above my father's worn oak workbench beside military memorabilia and framed pictures from local car shows. Officer Perez slowly walked inside, taking in every detail without touching anything. Linda followed close behind him, pointing toward shelves filled with motor oil and spare parts. "See that? Commercial inventory." Officer Perez glanced at the shelves before asking me a simple question. "How many vehicles do you personally own?" "4," I answered. "3 classics and my daily pickup." He nodded thoughtfully. Across the garage, the older gentleman wearing the faded navy polo calmly thanked Susan for another glass of lemonade before taking another bite of his cheeseburger. He never looked toward the officers. He never tried to join the conversation. He simply enjoyed the afternoon exactly like everyone else, completely unnoticed by the one person who believed she already knew everything happening inside my garage. Officer Mitchell continued walking through the garage with the deliberate pace of someone who had learned long ago that first impressions rarely tell the whole story. He paused beside the cherry-red Camaro, studying the flawless paint before looking toward the engine bay, where polished chrome reflected the overhead lights. "Beautiful work," he said quietly. "Thank you," I replied. "It belonged to my father. It took almost 3 years to restore." He gave a respectful nod and kept moving, saying nothing more. Officer Perez stepped outside for a moment and slowly walked the length of the driveway. He looked at every parked vehicle, checked that emergency access remained completely open, and observed children tossing their footballs safely on the grass instead of anywhere near traffic. The neighborhood looked exactly like dozens of peaceful suburban weekends across America. Linda, however, refused to let the silence work against her. She hurried after the officers, pointing from one harmless detail to another as though every ordinary object could somehow become evidence if she described it dramatically enough. "Those folding tables prove he is hosting public events," she insisted. "Look at all these people. Look at the vehicles. Look at the equipment. He is operating a business." Frank could not help smiling as he lifted the lid off the smoker. A cloud of fragrant brisket smoke drifted into the afternoon air. "The only thing Ethan is selling," he joked, "is cholesterol." A few quiet chuckles spread through the group before everyone immediately became respectful again. Nobody wanted to make the officer's job more difficult. Officer Mitchell simply smiled politely before asking another question. "Has anyone here paid to attend today?" Heads shook almost in perfect unison. Susan held up her casserole dish. "I brought lunch." One retired firefighter lifted a cooler filled with bottled water. "I brought drinks." Another neighbor raised a homemade apple pie wrapped in aluminum foil. "Dessert came from my kitchen." Every answer sounded exactly like what it was. Neighbors contributing to a community meal instead of customers attending an event. Linda quickly opened her thick folder and began handing Officer Mitchell printed photographs. These show repeated violations over the past 2 years. He accepted them without comment. The first photograph showed my garage door open while I washed the Camaro. Another showed me helping a teenage neighbor replace worn brake pads on his pickup truck. One captured several veterans standing around my workbench on Memorial Day sharing stories over coffee. The final photograph showed folding chairs in my driveway during another Saturday barbecue. Officer Mitchell slowly turned each page before looking back at Linda. "Who took these photographs?" "I did," she answered proudly. "Every single one." He nodded thoughtfully and handed the stack to Officer Perez, who quietly continued reviewing them. The afternoon breeze carried the smell of fresh-cut grass across the driveway, while the charcoal settled with a soft crackling sound inside the grill. Everything felt strangely peaceful despite the tension, standing only a few feet away. Then Officer Mitchell asked the question that changed the rhythm of the entire conversation. "Ma'am, can you identify the specific state law or city ordinance you believe has been violated today?" Linda blinked. Her confident smile faded for only a second before she answered. "The Homeowners Association regulations clearly prohibit." He gently interrupted without raising his voice. "I understand the Homeowners Association has its own rules. I am asking about the law." Silence settled over the driveway again. Linda searched through her folder more quickly now, turning pages that suddenly seemed less helpful than before. Across the garage, the older gentleman in the faded navy polo quietly folded his paper napkin, finished the last bite of his cheeseburger, and stood from his chair with the calm confidence of someone who had absolutely no reason to hurry. Neither officer had noticed him yet, but I had the unmistakable feeling that moment was only a heartbeat away. I watched the older gentleman take 3 slow steps away from the folding chair, balancing his empty paper plate in one hand as though nothing unusual was happening around him. The movement was so ordinary that almost nobody paid attention except Officer Daniel Perez, whose eyes happened to meet his for just a brief second. The young officer immediately stopped turning the pages inside Linda's folder. His posture straightened almost instinctively. "Chief Brooks," he said, the surprise in his voice impossible to hide. Every conversation in the driveway disappeared. Even the children holding the football stopped moving. The older man smiled warmly beneath the brim of his faded baseball cap. "Good afternoon, Daniel," he replied with the easy tone of someone greeting an old colleague instead of interrupting an investigation. "Looks like you drew neighborhood duty today." Officer Ryan Mitchell turned around so quickly that even Linda looked confused. The moment he recognized the man standing beside my father's workbench, he extended his hand immediately. "Chief Brooks, I had no idea you were here." Daniel Brooks shook his hand with an easy smile. "Today I am just another guest enjoying a good barbecue. Ethan invited me over because my wife is visiting our daughter this weekend, and he knows I never turn down brisket cooked over real oak." A ripple of quiet laughter spread across the driveway. The tension that had been building all afternoon loosened ever so slightly, except on one face. Linda Whitmore stared at the chief as though the entire script she had imagined had suddenly disappeared. "Wait," she said, trying to recover her confidence. "You actually know him?" Chief Brooks nodded without hesitation. "I have known Ethan for several years. He restored my father's old pickup truck after it sat unused for nearly 2 decades. The craftsmanship impressed me, but his honesty impressed me even more." I looked down for a moment, never particularly comfortable receiving compliments in front of a crowd. Linda quickly redirected her attention toward the officers. "That does not change the fact that he is violating the rules." The chief calmly looked around the garage before answering. His eyes moved across the neatly arranged tool cabinets, the polished Camaro, the folding tables filled with homemade food, the neighbors talking quietly, and the children waiting patiently beside their parents. "What I see," he said evenly, "is a neighborhood gathering." Linda immediately lifted her folder again. "The Homeowners Association has documented repeated violations." Chief Brooks accepted the folder politely and reviewed several pages before closing it. "These are Homeowners Association records." "Exactly," Linda answered. "That is why law enforcement needs to act." The chief returned the folder to her without changing his expression. "Our responsibility is to enforce state law and city ordinances. Private association disagreements do not automatically become police matters unless there is evidence of an actual legal violation." Officer Mitchell quietly nodded in agreement, while Officer Perez glanced once more around the property, almost as though he were seeing the entire afternoon from a different perspective now. Linda folded her arms tightly. "So you are saying none of this matters?" Chief Brooks answered with remarkable patience. "I am saying facts matter. That is why investigations exist." He turned toward Officer Mitchell. "Ryan, continue exactly as you would on any other call. Verify the complaint objectively. If there is a violation, document it. If there is not, document that as well." Those words carried more authority than any raised voice ever could. Watching him stand there with a paper napkin still tucked casually into one pocket of his jeans, I realized something my father had tried to teach me years earlier. The strongest people in the room are rarely the ones trying to prove that they are important. Chief Brooks never once suggested that anyone skip a step simply because he happened to know me. That was exactly why people respected him. He looked first at Officer Mitchell, then at Officer Perez, and finally toward the driveway where Linda still stood clutching her folder. "Complete the investigation exactly as you normally would," he said. "Facts first. Opinions later." Both officers nodded immediately. Officer Perez retrieved a small sound level meter from the patrol vehicle and returned to the sidewalk, while Officer Mitchell slowly walked the perimeter of my property. They measured the distance between parked vehicles and the curb, confirmed that every fire hydrant remained unobstructed, checked that emergency access stayed completely open, and observed traffic flowing normally through the neighborhood. The only vehicles parked along the street belonged to neighbors who lived within walking distance or guests legally parked against the curb. Nobody blocked a driveway. Nobody blocked an intersection. The warm breeze carried the smell of grilled corn and smoked brisket across the yards while birds continued singing from the maple trees overhead. Officer Perez stood quietly for several moments holding the sound meter toward the garage where soft classic rock still played in the background. He checked the display before looking toward Officer Mitchell. "Reading is below the city evening noise limit," he reported calmly. Linda immediately stepped forward. "That is because they turned the music down after I called." Officer Mitchell answered with the same patient professionalism he had shown since arriving. "Ma'am, we document the conditions we observe." There was no frustration in his voice, only procedure. Inside the garage, he continued examining the space carefully. He looked for customer invoices, business signs, price lists, repair orders, payment terminals, advertising materials, or anything suggesting a commercial operation. Instead, he found framed family photographs, trophies from local car shows, military service plaques belonging to several veterans who visited every month, and my father's old oak workbench covered with carefully arranged tools that had been in our family for decades. A handwritten chalkboard leaned against one wall listing nothing except the afternoon menu: smoked brisket, cheeseburgers, baked beans, grilled corn, potato salad, peach cobbler, lemonade, and coffee. Chief Brooks smiled when he noticed it. "Looks like I picked the right afternoon to stop by," he said with a quiet grin. Several neighbors laughed softly. Linda did not. She pointed toward a shelf filled with neatly organized engine parts. "There. He repairs vehicles for people." I answered honestly. "Sometimes I help friends after work the same way neighbors help each other repair fences or replace roofs. I do not advertise. I do not employ anyone. I do not operate a commercial shop." Before another question could be asked, I reached toward the familiar black binder resting beside my father's workbench. Years of organized paperwork reflected the overhead lights as I opened it across the bench. Every page sat inside clear protective sleeves arranged by date. Certified letters, property surveys, city zoning confirmations, copies of previous complaints marked closed without violations, email correspondence, photographs with timestamps. Every document told the same story without emotion or exaggeration. I handed the binder to Officer Mitchell. He slowly turned each page while Chief Brooks quietly observed over his shoulder. Neither man hurried. Neither interrupted. The only sounds inside the garage were the soft rustling of paper, the distant laughter of children beginning another football game outside, and the steady hiss of charcoal settling beneath the grill. Finally, Officer Mitchell looked up from the binder and nodded thoughtfully. "Mr. Walker appears to have documented every interaction connected to these complaints." Linda folded her arms even tighter. "That only proves he planned for this." Chief Brooks looked at her calmly before answering. "Or perhaps it proves he understood that careful records often become the clearest evidence when misunderstandings happen." Those words settled across the garage more heavily than any accusation ever could, and for the first time since the patrol cars arrived, I noticed uncertainty replacing confidence in Linda's eyes. Officer Perez clipped the sound meter back onto his duty belt just as the radio on his shoulder crackled softly with a routine status check from dispatch. He acknowledged the call, then glanced toward Chief Brooks, who gave a nearly invisible nod. "Dispatch," Officer Perez said calmly. "Can you run the recent service history for this address and advise?" The request sounded completely ordinary, but something about it made Linda shift her weight ever so slightly. Until that moment, She had controlled every conversation by telling her version of events. Now the information would come from somewhere that had no reason to favor either of us. The neighborhood grew strangely quiet again. The charcoal inside the grill settled with a gentle hiss, while someone closed the lid to keep the brisket warm. The smell of smoked oak drifted across the driveway as everyone waited for the dispatcher to respond. "Stand by," the voice answered through the radio. Nobody spoke. I leaned one hand against my father's old workbench, watching the evening sunlight stretch across the polished hood of the Camaro. My black binder remained open beside me, every page still neatly arranged exactly where it belonged. A few seconds later, the dispatcher returned. "Unit 12, records indicate 31 calls associated with this address over approximately the past 24 months. Officer Perez looked toward Officer Mitchell before asking, "Can you provide dispositions?" "Affirmative. All calls cleared after investigation. No criminal violations located. No enforcement action taken. No citations issued." Officer Mitchell quietly wrote several notes into his field notebook without changing expression. Linda immediately stepped forward. "That only proves nobody took the situation seriously before today." Chief Brooks folded his hands comfortably in front of him. "Or it may suggest every responding officer reached the same conclusion after examining the facts." The dispatcher continued speaking through the radio. "Records also indicate the majority of complaints originated from the same reporting party." Officer Perez asked the obvious follow-up. "Can you identify the reporting party?" Another brief pause followed before the answer came back. "Linda Whitmore." Nobody reacted dramatically. There were no gasps, no applause, no raised voices. The truth simply arrived, calm and matter-of-fact, exactly the way truth usually does. Linda looked toward the officers, then toward me, searching for support that never appeared. "I reported what I believed was happening," she said, her voice noticeably quieter than before. Chief Brooks nodded respectfully. "Every resident has the right to report concerns in good faith. Our responsibility is simply to determine whether those concerns are supported by evidence." Officer Mitchell gently closed my binder after reviewing one final page and handed it back to me with both hands. "You have maintained exceptionally thorough records, Mr. Walker." I smiled slightly. My father always believed memories fade, but paperwork does not. The chief gave a quiet smile at that. He was absolutely right. As Officer Perez continued checking the final entries on the dispatch history, one loose sheet slipped from Linda's folder onto the driveway. Officer Mitchell bent down to return it, but before handing it back, he noticed something printed across the top. It was a handwritten calendar covering nearly an entire year. Every first Saturday had been circled in bright red marker. Beside each date were small notes. "Watch garage, photograph visitors, document vehicles, call if necessary." He looked at the page for only a moment before politely returning it. Chief Brooks had already seen enough. He never commented on the paper directly. Instead, he simply looked around the garage filled with neighbors sharing food, children laughing once again outside, and families enjoying the kind of afternoon that should never have required an emergency response. Then he quietly asked one final question that seemed almost effortless. "Ryan, based on everything you have personally observed today, is there any evidence that this gathering violates state law or city ordinance?" Officer Mitchell answered without hesitation. "No, Chief. None whatsoever." Chief Brooks waited until Officer Mitchell finished writing the final notes in his field notebook before speaking again. His voice remained calm, steady, and almost conversational, yet every person standing in my driveway listened carefully. "Based on today's investigation," he said, "there is no evidence of any violation of state law or city ordinance." Nobody cheered. Nobody interrupted. The conclusion did not need drama because the facts had already done all the work. Officer Mitchell nodded once and closed his notebook. "The call will be documented as unfounded based on the conditions observed at the scene." Officer Perez added quietly, "The property is in compliance with what we observed today." Linda looked from one officer to the other as though she expected someone to change their mind at the last second. "So you are simply leaving?" she asked, unable to hide the disbelief in her voice. Chief Brooks answered with the same patience he had shown from the beginning. "We are completing our investigation according to the evidence. That is our responsibility." The warm evening breeze carried the smell of smoked brisket and grilled corn across the driveway, while someone carefully uncovered another tray of fresh peach cobbler waiting beside the folding tables. Life seemed eager to return to normal the moment the tension disappeared. Chief Brooks turned toward Linda again, not with anger, but with genuine professionalism. Every resident has the right to contact emergency services when they sincerely believe there is an immediate public safety concern. However, neighborhood disagreements and homeowners association disputes are often better addressed through civil communication, mediation, or the appropriate administrative process when no legal violation exists. Linda looked down at the thick folder she had carried so confidently only an hour earlier. It suddenly seemed much heavier than before. Officer Mitchell removed a small information card from his uniform pocket and handed it to her respectfully. This contains contact information for the city's neighborhood mediation program. It is often a better first step when concerns involve private disputes rather than emergencies. She accepted the card without speaking. Across the garage, Frank quietly reopened the smoker, releasing another wave of fragrant oak smoke that blended with the sweet smell of baked peaches and cinnamon. Susan began placing clean paper plates back onto the serving table, while several neighbors slowly resumed conversations they had paused when the patrol cars first arrived. Children picked up the football again, laughing as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Watching them reminded me how quickly ordinary life returns once fear leaves the room. Chief Brooks walked over to my father's old workbench where the black binder still rested beside the neatly arranged tools. He lightly tapped the cover with one finger before looking at me. "Keep doing exactly what you have been doing," he said quietly. "Good records protect honest people." I smiled. That lesson belonged to my father long before it belonged to me. The chief nodded with genuine respect. "Then he left you something far more valuable than a garage." Before heading toward the patrol vehicles, Officer Perez paused beside the cherry-red Camaro one last time. "I hope to see this at the county car show next month," he said with a grin. "You will," I answered, "assuming it behaves itself." Even Officer Mitchell laughed softly at that. Linda slowly turned toward the sidewalk, carrying her folder beneath one arm and the mediation card in the other hand. No one mocked her. No one celebrated her disappointment. The neighborhood simply gave her space to leave with dignity. As the patrol cars rolled quietly away beneath the soft orange glow of the setting sun, the reflections of their blue lights faded from the polished chrome, until only warm evening light remained. The garage once again smelled like coffee, oak smoke, fresh paint, and honest work, exactly the way my father always believed it should. Several weeks passed, and before I realized it, another first Saturday arrived with the same familiar rhythm that had filled my father's garage for as long as I could remember. The garage door rolled upward just after sunrise, letting warm morning light spill across polished chrome, organized tool cabinets, and the cherry-red Camaro that had become almost as much a part of the neighborhood as the maple trees lining our street. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with motor oil before charcoal slowly replaced both as the grill warmed beneath the clear blue sky. Friends began arriving one after another without invitations because they already knew the tradition. Frank carried another tray of smoked brisket. Susan arrived with her famous peach cobbler. The retired firefighters parked beside the curb and immediately started debating classic engines with the veterans who never seemed to agree about anything except the importance of good barbecue. Children ran across the lawns carrying a football, while parents settled into folding chairs beneath the shade, talking about work, family, and the small, everyday moments that somehow mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Looking around that afternoon, it felt as though the neighborhood had quietly remembered what it was supposed to be all along. Something else had changed as well. The stack of violation notices stopped appearing in my mailbox. The constant photographs from across the street disappeared. Instead of watching every gathering from behind crossed arms, Linda simply continued with her own routine without trying to interrupt everyone else's. Months later, during an open homeowners association meeting, several neighbors respectfully suggested creating clearer procedures for handling concerns before involving emergency services whenever possible. The discussion remained calm from beginning to end. Nobody pointed fingers. Nobody raised their voice. Policies were updated. Communication improved. The meeting ended the same way my father always preferred ending disagreements, with neighbors shaking hands instead of walking away angry. Every now and then someone still asks about the thick black binder sitting on the shelf beside my father's old workbench. They assume I keep it because I expect another confrontation someday. The truth is much simpler. I keep it there because it reminds me that preparation is never wasted, even when you hope you never need it again. Right beside that binder hangs the old blue shop towel I used on the afternoon everything changed. The towel is ordinary. The binder is ordinary. The workbench is ordinary. Yet together they remind me that the strongest foundations are built from small habits repeated over many years. One quiet afternoon, Chief Brooks stopped by again after finishing work. This time there were no patrol cars, no investigation, and no uncomfortable silence waiting to be broken. He accepted a cup of coffee, admired the nearly finished restoration of another classic pickup, and laughed with everyone else while the smell of oak smoke drifted lazily through the open garage door. Before leaving, he looked around at the families, the neighbors, the children playing football, and the old Camaro reflecting the late afternoon sun. This, he said with a quiet smile, is exactly what communities are supposed to look like. I watched him drive away before turning back toward my father's workbench. The binder remained untouched. The tools rested exactly where he had left them years ago. The laughter outside blended with the gentle crackle of charcoal and the familiar sound of friends arguing over which classic engine was built best. Standing there, I realized the greatest victory had never been proving someone wrong. It was protecting the simple traditions worth passing to the next generation. My father always believed that real character could not be measured by the loudest voice in the neighborhood, but by the quiet choices a person made when nobody expected recognition. Looking around my garage one more time, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Authority may demand attention for a moment, but honesty, patience, and respect are the things people remember long after the noise has disappeared.